I'd thought about going on a double date, but not with my husband. He pretended to agree and then took revenge on me that day. Life moves pretty fast, and it can be surprising how things play out. I ended up having a pretty rough time because I'd acted on something I thought would be harmless. It was supposed to be a harmless act, and I'd wanted to try it out because I'd felt it would spice up my marriage and make my husband more protective over me. You know how it goes. I thought it would go smoothly, but it didn't. I wanted to do a double date because my friend from college had been pushing for it. We barely get to hang out since we got married, so I agreed and told my husband of 5 years about it. He hadn't even acted like I had told him something, and this was how it had been in our marriage ever since I gave birth to my child. It had been 3 years since my son was born, so I thought I'd liven up the double date by going with my friend's husband while my friend went with mine. I'd even planned to go home with our exchange partners for the night, but it was obvious that nothing was going to happen. It was just going to be a fun night. That was my plan. I hadn't meant for everything to go haywire in my life from that night alone. I told my husband about the plan and the date, and I was so shocked at how easily he agreed. I should have had a feeling that something was going to happen. I should never have agreed to the double date at 8. When my friend's husband came to pick me up, we headed off to the restaurant. I was sealing my fate as a very stupid woman. The new definition of stupid was me. We got to the restaurant and my friend and my husband were already waiting. My friend hadn't had any issues with the double date or the idea. She wanted to spice things up. She was even with me because she wanted her husband to appreciate her in a new light. If he saw another man's hands all over her, the date would have been a lot more intense. It was calm at the beginning, and I would have never expected the outcome to be totally different. My husband had agreed to it, but I hadn't known he had fake agreed to it. After dinner at the restaurant we had booked, we left to go and spend some time together at a park. We played games together, and my husband didn't seem uncomfortable or angry at all. I was even mad that he seemed more comfortable with my friend than with me. I was livid. I had done all this to get his attention, and he was smiling at my friend. Can you imagine that? Anyway, my friend hadn't known about the second phase of the date, where we would spend some time with our partners at their home before going home. I'd asked my husband to drop her off at our house and said my friend's husband would take me back. We'd all meet up at my house and my friend's husband would take my friend home. That was the plan, but what they didn't know was that I wanted more time with my friend's husband. I went home with my friend's husband, and he took me to their place. I was finally alone with the man I'd been having an affair with. That wasn't my husband. I didn't expect that, did you? Well, I didn't expect my husband to find out either, but there I was with my lips on my friend's husband when my husband barged into the room and caught us. I was shocked. Then my whole life flashed before my eyes as my husband flung me away and started beating up my friend's husband. My friend was right behind him with her eyes open just as wide as mine were. This was not how the night was supposed to go. The next thing I heard had been. Then the sirens and the police came in, and I thought they were going to arrest my husband for starting a fight, but they arrested me instead. I got arrested by my husband. I'm sure you weren't expecting this, and maybe I deserved it, but that's up to you to decide. I don't care what you think. My name is Chloe, short for my official name, which I can't give you. I'm 31 years old. I'll call my husband Leo, although I think he's also 31 or 32. Leo isn't his real name, but I'm using it for clarity's sake. I'll get to the main event of how and why I ended up arrested. I got to know Leo when we were still in high school. He was the quiet and charming type that looked unapproachable, but was very nice and friendly once you got to know him. I had just transferred to the school, and the person the principal had me meet was Leo and I met in high school. He was a straight A student, and I was the clingy one because I didn't know anyone at school. I didn't have any friends, and wasn't about to start making friends, so I forced myself on Leo. He was cool with it, and we spent our high school days together until we graduated and moved on to college. I didn't see Leo after that. After high school we went to different colleges, so I didn't see Leo again for 4 years. I bumped into him at a friend's party. My friend Lila, who I'd been having an affair with, invited me to her 22nd birthday party. I'd met her in college, and she was one of my closest friends, so I went. I saw Leo there and he looked great. We met up for drinks and got to know each other better. Leo was great company, but he was always focused on his business and work. I didn't think he'd be interested in me at first, but then he asked me out on a date. I said yes, and we started dating. I dated Leo for 2 years and saw a future with him. I really loved Leo, but I didn't realize that his lack of attention was going to cause problems in our marriage. After dating for 2 years, Leo and I got married in a small, intimate ceremony with just my family and his. I think this is where I started having issues with him. He never listened to me. I had told Leo that I wanted a big wedding, one I could show off to my friends and maybe at social events. I hadn't been happy with how the wedding planning the ceremony itself had been planned by his mom, and I didn't like my dress. But I couldn't complain because I was marrying the man I loved. I thought to myself that the wedding could have been small, but the honeymoon would surely be bigger. There wasn't even a honeymoon 1 year into the marriage. Sure, he took care of me and provided for me, but I felt like this wasn't what I'd dreamed of. I guess I had this idea of what marriage was supposed to be like. Leo was always out hustling for his business and money. He was always all about work. Even when he got back home, it was like his brain couldn't rest if I was talking to him. He would zone out or be working on his laptop and wouldn't seem to hear what I said until I asked for the 3rd time. Talking to my husband now seemed like a hassle. Was this how a marriage was supposed to work? Even when we marked our 1-year anniversary, I wasn't sure. The year anniversary was a bit of a waste of money because he seemed aloof. I even wondered why he'd bothered to book the weekend getaway, because it felt like I was there for myself. If we hadn't gone, I wouldn't have met Lila's husband, and I wouldn't have gotten myself into this mess. Yes, I would have still been happily married if I'd put in the effort to make my marriage work and not tried to sort myself out from jail. This was where my downfall and the web of lies had all started. It was our 1-year anniversary, and Leo had booked a trip that he didn't seem to care about. I was left alone to wander around the hotel. My husband had booked a room for himself. As I mentioned earlier, this was when I met Lila's husband. I didn't know he was married to Lila or even that she was involved with him at the time. If I had known from the beginning, I wouldn't have had anything to do with him. But by the time I found out, it was too late. I was already involved. I was in a deep, dark place and couldn't see a way out. I met Lila's husband, Kelvin, not his real name, when I'd gone down for a spa massage while my husband was busy with work. Kelvin made me laugh throughout the whole massage session. He'd also been down and wanted to get a massage done and facials too. In my whole life, I'd never met a guy that was interested in the quality of his skin, so I was really intrigued. I knew it wasn't a good idea to get to be friends with another man, while I knew that being married was a bad sign, so I tried to focus on my husband throughout the entire dinner. Leo was always busy, like during the dinner that he had paid for. We had been halfway through it when his phone rang and he had to excuse himself to take the call. I waited and waited for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and Leo never showed up again. I was annoyed because what was supposed to be romantic for me was a disaster. The waiters had to come and tell me that I was really tired and wanted to go to bed, but it was already almost 4 a.m. You wouldn't believe that I'd got back to the hotel and found Leo on the bed, sleeping like a baby. He'd forgotten that he'd left me back at the restaurant after the business call I'd given him a hard time about. I apologize, but I wanted to give you an example of how aloof and inattentive my husband was in our marriage before I got pregnant. I'm sorry for going on too long. I love that you're all my audience anyway. I got close to Kelvin from the station because we had exchanged numbers to keep in touch. But I didn't have any idea he was involved with Lila at the time. We'd been talking for a while at the spa, and Kelvin and I had become close. We had a lot of conversations and got to know each other well. I still didn't know about Lila, or anything else for that matter. I had slept with Kelvin before I found out he was involved with Lila. I'm sure you all saw this coming. It was an honest mistake. I hadn't realized how things had got to that point until it actually happened. We had become close, and I was spending a lot of time with him while my husband was away. His business, and not paying any mind to me. It was like Leo didn't care what I did. I tried to show interest in what he liked in his work, but he never encouraged me, so I just hung out with Kelvin instead. Kelvin, who had paid more attention to me than the man I had married. Well, that's a long story. In short, I visited one day at Kelvin's place. I guess it was a guest house at the time, One thing led to another and we ended up in bed together. I was pretty shocked and I stopped all communication with Kelvin. I was really scared that my husband would find out and throw me out on my ear. I deleted all my chats with Kelvin and even blocked his number so he couldn't call me. I didn't want my husband to find out I loved the man and wanted my marriage, but I couldn't let him find out that I had cheated on him. Fast forward to 2 months later, after I had blocked Kelvin, I discovered I was pregnant, and you guessed right, it was Kelvin's child. I couldn't let my husband know that I knew it was Kelvin's child from the bottom of my heart. If my husband found out, I'd be gone, so I made my husband sleep with me. A month later I told him I was pregnant, even though I was already 3 months along. Feel free to call me whatever names you want in the comments, but I did what I had to do to secure a future for my son and myself. Besides, my husband was the father of my child on paper, and that was all that mattered. You all needed to see how much Leo began taking care of me once he found out I was pregnant. I felt like I was a goddess before his very eyes. My whole pregnancy journey made me love my husband even more. He treated me like I was the golden egg, getting me whatever I wanted and treating me like I shouldn't have to lift a finger. I thought that from there on in, my life was going to be plain sailing, but I was so wrong. If I'd been told 3 years later that I'd be arrested and facing a lawsuit in divorce papers, I wouldn't have taken this path. I would have been the perfect wife and tried to make my marriage work. I regret it, but what could I do? I'd already got myself tangled up in the lies from the moment I told. I was already in it from the first time I met Kelvin. What do you think I should have done? Well, it was too late to confess at the time. I met Kelvin again at my baby shower in Elmau. That's when I found out he and Lila had been dating for over 2 years. Our fling only lasted a year, so Kelvin was already dating my friend when we had an affair. I was shocked, and Kelvin found out that the child was his. I never told him, but he found out just by looking at the baby. Then he asked me, so I had to confess that it was him that was the father. I hadn't known. I would use that information to try to blackmail him, but I'm getting to that. I confronted him about dating my friend, and he had just simply shrugged. He then had the audacity to ask when I was going to give him his son. I told him he was never going to get anywhere near my child. I think it was this statement that, I think he was triggered by what I said. He couldn't tell everyone at the shower that the baby was his because that would expose his cheating to LLA. So he kept it to himself. That event passed after I gave birth to our son. My husband's attitude switched back to normal. He loved our son, of course, but then he stopped treating me with the care and attention he had before. Fast forward 2 years, and my life was pretty good. I'd learned to live with my husband without any major issues. I'd even gone ahead and got a DNA test result for him when he'd asked for it. When you're in a desperate situation, you have to think outside the box. I wanted to be prepared for anything. I know people who have done worse than me, so I don't want to be judged. I wanted my child to have a father, and I didn't think Kelvin was going to end up in my life, or that I was going to end up in prison. I had never thought I was going to set myself up to fail. Everything I had thought was erased. I had stayed 2 years without any questions or my husband finding out, but all that was about to come to light. I received a call one day that I needed to pay a sum of money to an account, or they were going to expose my secret to my husband. At the time, I hadn't known it was Kelvin, and I was scared. I knew the person was going to act on his word, so I transferred what I had in my savings to the person's account first thing in the morning. When you have a secret to hide, and you're willing to do anything to cover it up, that's where I was at that point. Kelvin knew, so he used that to his advantage. He kept coming back for more money, so I had to sell my things after I'd asked my parents for help. One day, I had the courage to tell the blackmailer to do his worst. I didn't have any money to give him. Kelvin revealed who he really was. He was just trying to gather money to be able to start something of his own so he could leave LA. This was someone that they had been married for 2 years. He went off like he wanted to leave Lila and come for custody of his son, so he was blackmailing me to give him money. He asked me for money, and I don't know if you've ever heard of a more ridiculous excuse. What was even more ridiculous was that I fell for it. My husband had left me and was focused on work again, and he was only concerned about his son. I remembered how it was with Kelvin, and I'll be honest, I had fantasized about getting married to Kelvin. I had stupidly believed him. I know I was a shitty person for doing so, but I had nothing to depend on from my husband. There were no displays of affection, no demonstrations of love, no words of affirmation. I was frustrated, and I listened to Kelvin and fell for him again. He was telling me how he wanted us to be together. I hadn't been that stupid about the money I'd given him. Of course I'd asked him about it. He'd told me he'd give me back double when I was finally his. I fell for his sweet talk for the second time and started doing what he wanted. It was like I'd been brainwashed and couldn't think. For myself, it was just small things at first. Get something valuable and pawn it, then send the money to Kelvin. I would do it. I would give him what he wanted, whatever it was. He flirted with me and made me laugh like before. I was completely gone for Kelvin, while I had even considered divorcing my husband. My husband was the one who I thought I could trust to help me get out of the web of lies that Kelvin had created for me. I was told that if I divorced my husband, I wouldn't be able to get a share of his property. I was advised to take it little by little until I had gotten enough, and then I would file for divorce and we would get married, and live with our son. This may seem like a trick, but this was my life now. I suppose it was a bit of a trick, but it was my life now. In a way, it was as if a spell had covered my eyes, making me always willing to do what he wanted. I'm not writing a fiction piece here, but my real-life experience. As I'm typing this, I can't even believe that I had fallen for that nonsense. Once the person who had made you do all the bad things had disappeared, and you were the one facing the bail bill in community service. It seems like the eye clears up after the bad action has been done. It's time to face the consequences, laugh out loud, and I faced them like a madman anyway. Kelvin stopped. He took a short break and then tried to rebuild the relationship between us. He wanted to get Kelvin and me on the same page sexually. He was a master manipulator. As a result, I started to see my husband as someone who had never wanted to marry me. Kelvin was so convincing. He said all the right things and everything I wanted to hear. I even confronted my husband about it once. I'd almost let it slip that I was always talking with Lila's husband, which would have raised Leo's eyebrows. It surely had to have raised Leo's eyebrows because the night I confronted him, I was pretty emotional and raised my voice. I asked him why he didn't like me and only showered our son with attention and affection. I also asked why he never wanted to talk to me and saw me as a pesky little cockroach. Leo just stared at me like I was talking through my nose. I told him that Lila's husband was the total opposite of me. He looked at me like I'd just said something I had to cover up by saying it was what Lila had talked about when she described her husband. EID used to say what I'd said the next day. Leo said he wanted to take our son to the hospital for his monthly checkup, but I was way ahead of him on this. I knew he wanted to do a DNA test, but I didn't know it would be because of what I'd said. I'd followed him to the hospital, and luckily it was my friend Lila working that shift. They'd finished the test. She'd sent them home to come back the next day. I walked up to Lila 30 minutes later and told her we already had the paternity test record and had just misplaced it. So there was no need for us to do it a second time. She believed me, obviously, because she was my friend. Even though I was trying to hide something, she'd hide it with me and not rat me out. I gave her the document from the one I had brought to prove to her it didn't look fake. She had handed it back to me. I knew I could give it to my husband from this because if it could pass an eligibility check by a healthcare officer, my husband would never know it was fake. So I handed it over to my husband, and he hadn't questioned that it was fake. I knew it was fake, and I even tried to make him feel guilty for wanting to conduct a DNA check to see if our son was his. A little while later, Kelvin started asking for things again, so I had to resort to forging my husband's signature on his checks. I had a talent for copying people's handwriting and calligraphy. I had copied my mom's signature on a homework sheet in middle school. At first, I had only taken a little amount from my husband's account. I took from the one that he wouldn't notice. I had studied Leo's accounts to know which he checks frequently and which he doesn't. I had tried to take an interest in his business and the things he liked. I'm sure you must have noticed. I wondered why I hadn't just asked him for money. I had thought of that, but as I was talking with Kelvin, I found my mind had no control of its own. I only did what Kelvin wanted. I didn't think I was going to be caught. I realized I had just been utterly stupid from the day I met Kelvin. I had betrayed my friend and slept with her husband. I was even dreaming of having a thing for said husband. I was in a loop anyway. A month passed and I noticed a pattern. When I gave Kelvin what he wanted for the week, he would disappear and not talk to me. Then, when he wanted me to steal another money from my husband, he would begin his sweet talking, and I fell for it every single time. It was his idea to do the double. I had sold it to my husband, and Kelvin had told me that after the date, I should send my husband divorce papers and pack my things and my son's things. We would disappear with him. The double date was so he could show the world how well we looked together before we disappeared. I just realized I was a victim of his. Is it cyberbullying or cyber sweet talk? I got into it myself and I could have ended it, but I didn't. I decided to be deceived by Kelvin. So, in short, we did the double date with our spouses and the night ended with me sleeping in a jail cell after being charged for forging my husband's signature and stealing his money. Everything's cleared up now and I realized I was on the brink of losing my marriage, my child and my husband, so I started begging Leo. He'd followed us to the police station and served me divorce papers, ordering me to sign them if I didn't want my sentence to be even double. I panicked and signed them quickly, begging him to forgive me. I didn't know what came over me. My husband had just said he would. He said he'd see me in court. Then he asked me how stupid I was. That was a funny moment because I couldn't really tell how stupid I'd become. Leo asked if I'd ever thought for 1 second that I was taking money from his bank without his knowledge. I just sat there, quiet and humble, filled with regret. It seems he also knew my son wasn't his. I was blown away when I found out he'd done a DNA test while I was still in hospital. I'd played right into his hands by taking the test, and then he'd used it to try to catch me out. I'd gone behind his back to steal money from him, and I ended up spending the night in jail. I thought Kelvin would have been arrested too, but he wasn't. He'd also injured 2 police officers and there were lots of other crimes on his list. It turned out that he was a professional scammer and had only been with Lila to scam her. She'd been tight-lipped, and the process had proved difficult, so he'd resorted to me, the easy target. Oh, Lila! The shock on her face when she saw me with her husband was still imprinted on my brain. She had seen me with her husband and I still couldn't find the words to describe it. I really hope she can forgive me, wherever she is. After placing a call to my parents, I got a lawyer. I told them the lawyer was for my divorce, not for defending me against charges of forgery and theft. By the time the court date came around, my lawyer helped me get off with a fine and community service, but I still lost access to my child. The boy was going to be put into the system because his mother was a criminal, and Leo refused to claim him because he wasn't his. I was heartbroken and couldn't even begin to describe how I felt when I heard the judgment. I had to pay a fine of $5,000. I ended up with huge debts just from paying that money and settling with my lawyer. My parents said they wanted nothing to do with me after giving me $3. I was left with a $5,000 fine. Like I was being sold off. The news had reached them about what I did, and my father had called to tell me that he never wanted to see my face again. So, my son, my parents, my husband, my friend, they were all gone from my life over the web of lies I had gotten myself into and the person I had gotten involved with. I shouldn't have agreed to that double date. I would have been in the same situation either way. I should never have met Kelvin. I should have made my marriage work and stayed married to Leo. I should have made him love me, but now I have no one to turn to. There's nothing worse than having no one in your circle. 2 years later, I'm still dealing with the consequences of my actions. I've read all the comments about how wrong I was to do that to my husband and try to pass it off like I was being controlled. I've also seen the name-calling you're having a field day with. It's all well and good, but it could have happened to you anyway. Immediately after rounding up community services for 2 months, I was arrested again and charged with forgery of hospital documents. I knew that had to be Lila's. She'd drawn the hospital's attention to the forged documents, and I was arrested again. Lila had struck at the perfect time. I was still in debt and didn't have anybody on my side to help me. I was charged with 21 months imprisonment and the option to pay a fine. But I didn't have the money to get myself out of this mess, so I ended up going to prison. Those had been the worst months of my life because I had seen a lot and I had almost died. I had the scars to prove it. Anyway, I got out a few months ago and just thought I'd update you on my life. Yes, I'm still alive, and I regret every day why I had changed the course of my life. I couldn't get a job with my criminal record. It was like people knew about me or something. I had the words criminal past on my forehead. I had been job hunting for over 2 months and couldn't find anything. I even had trouble finding a basic job as a waitress. I regret ever spoiling my marriage with the idea of a double date. I had even gone to see Leo. I had gone to his house and watched from the shadows. Apparently, he married another woman. She was Lila, and they had a child. I guess it served me right.